I chose this topic this year because I feel that there's something going on in the culture. I think that in Jewish culture there is a return to belief, a return to God. There is certainly an emphasis on something called spirituality, which is religious experience. And I thought it was important to take a look at the various ways that contemporary Jews think about God. Now, when you think about God, it seems to me that Jewish tradition has thought about God the way you sort of think about your old uncle, right? The uncle who comes to the Thanksgiving table, who comes to the Pesach table, who is certainly important enough to you to make sure you call him on his birthday and on Yontif to say, hello, how are you? Do you need a place to be, Yontif and Shabbos? But not somebody who sort of like lives with you full time. And that's the sort of way that Jews, I think, traditionally thought about God. God was important, but not the emphasis. And certainly, God was important as a character in our collective narrative, but not something that we would spend a great deal of time killing each other, trying to figure out what we mean when we say God. As opposed to the Christian tradition, where the dogma, the question of who is God, and what is God, and how does one approach God, the details of belief are very, very important. Jews treated God like a member of the family. Like a member of the family. Of course he's there. Of course he's important to me. Of course we pray, God is there. Of course we tell stories of the Torah, God is there. But except for the very, very religiously enthusiastic, God was a member of the family. It's only when we came to America now and we settled in this country and with such ambivalent attitudes toward God that people began sort of giving it up. First, second generation Jews gave up God. And then came the crises of the mid-20th century. You have the Holocaust, which not only denied God and a question of God of history, the Holocaust took away all of our belief in the sort of progress of man. So even the liberal ideas of God were sort of destroyed by the Holocaust. And the advent of the State of Israel, which gave a new core to Jewish life, a new center to Jewish life, not religion, not prayer, not mitzvah, not Torah, but Israel. I told you this before. I think it's kind of curious that you can get up in pretty much any synagogue in America and declare out loud that you don't believe in God, that you don't believe in the truth of Torah, that you don't believe in the efficacy of prayer, and nothing will happen to you except the little old lady sitting behind you will ask you to move aside because she wants to see the bar mitzvah boy. But if you get up in pretty much any synagogue in America and declare that you don't think Israel should be a Jewish state, they'll kill you before you reach the exit. Heresy, blasphemy, rebellion against the core of Jewishness is BDS. It's a rebellion against Zionism, not the rebellion against theology. At least that's the way it was when I grew up. I grew up with a wonderfully sensitive, kind, loving, giving rabbi who never spoke about God from the bima, who never talked about the truth of Torah, who never discussed the meaning of prayer. Instead, he talked about Jewish community life, intermarriage, assimilation. He talked about Israel and the battle for Israel. He talked about life among Jews. He never talked about God. And when I went to rabbinical school, I remember going to ask him about that. How come you never talked to us about God? And he said, because it was impossible. He said after the Holocaust, people's minds were so farmish. They were so mixed up. There was so much anger and so much disappointment and so much frustration. There was no words to speak about it. So it was better not to speak about it. And I think that was the attitude in the community until about 1990 or so. Maybe it was coincident with the Clinton administration. I don't know. I don't want to get political. But somewhere in the 1990s, and I'll tell you what it was coincident with, is that we went from the first and second generations of American Jews to the third and fourth generation of American Jews. That is, Jews who were born here, whose grandparents were born here. By the time you're in a country this many generations, you settle in a certain way. And Jews began rediscovering things like spirituality and faith and God, and now it's a very lively topic. Now, when we talk about God, it seems to me that there's sort of two sources that inform that conversation. One source is experience, and one source is concept. So there are people, for example, for whom, if you ask them, what is your theology, they don't even know how to answer that question. There's a wonderful story of a friend of mine who's a rabbi who had a class of 16-year-olds in a confirmation group. These are the best kids in his temple, as a Reform rabbi, the best kids in the temple because they're the ones who chose to come back and learn after bar mitzvah. The best kids in the temple. So he asked the kids, how many of you believe in God? And not one hand went up. And he said, what? And the kids said, Rabbi, nobody believes in God anymore. Not with the way the world is. When we're scientific, we don't believe in God, and there's no God, and don't tell us to believe in God. We don't believe in God. And the rabbi was crestfallen because these are the best kids in the shul, in the temple. So he spent the next hour and a half trying to prove to them that God exists. And there are these philosophical arguments and philosophical proofs, and he laid them all out, and the kids at the end said, that was really interesting, Rabbi, but we still don't believe in God. And the poor guy went home and spent a miserable week. And then came back the next week and asked a different question. How many of you in your life have ever felt the presence of God? And wouldn't you know, every hand went up. Kids said, my mother lights Shabbos candles, and she closes her eyes and says a prayer. And I sort of feel like there's somebody listening to that prayer. Another kid said, my grandfather died. We went to the cemetery, all of us together. And we were standing around that grave. I felt something. I think God was there. And another kid said, my parents took me on a trip to Israel for my bar mitzvah. And when we got off the airplane, there was an airplane of immigrants coming from someplace else. And I watched these people get down and kiss the ground. And I felt that, my God, there was something there. And a kid said, I went to the kotel, to the wall, and there was something there. And every single kid had an answer to the question. Translation. There are many of us, and certainly many who are younger than us, who have experiences of transcendence, experiences of something more than us, experiences that reach toward the divine, that reach toward God, but they don't have a conceptual framework to talk about it. They don't have a vocabulary to talk about it. They can't conceptualize that experience, but they have a very strong and real experience. Yesterday I was in St. Louis for 2 days. There's a major conference in St. Louis. Some of you know Barry and Marlene Horowitz. Their son, Brad, is the organizer of the conference, so he invited me. It's a conference for song leaders, for the kids who lead music in all the summer camps and all the day schools around the country. So the music in this conference was out of this world. And the most wonderful thing was the prayer we did. And I'm sitting in a room, and first of all, I'll tell you, this is odd, because it doesn't happen to me very often. I was the oldest person in the room, right? And I'm sitting here, I'm this Altacocker in the room, And not just an Altacocker, but for those of you who understand this, I'm a Litvak. I'm a Misnagid Litvak, which means I'm Harold Schulweiss's student. For me, everything has to be conceptualized, rationalized, discussed, debated, worded out with vocabulary words, right? And here are kids, my kids' age. A lot of them knew my kids, which is really disconcerting, by the way, right? This young woman comes over to me, and I say, oh, she's a cute young woman, and she's coming over to me, and she wants to tell me that she knows my son, Oh. So, but the kids, they prayed with such kavanah, they prayed with such joy. They sang with such joy. There was such a sense of divinity in the room. And talking to them afterwards, they really do have they have a faithfulness to their own religious experiences. When I ask them, tell me about this God you're praying to, no answer. For them, it's not a conceptual question, it's an experiential question. And why can they have that experience and I can't? Well, for one thing, because they didn't live through the Holocaust. And they don't know survivors. I grew up with survivors, a lot of them in my community, in my family. And that did something to my belief in God. They don't have my set of experiences. For them, the world is bright and shiny, and there's something very powerfully positive that previous generations of Jews just didn't have. And for them, they have been given permission to imagine a relationship with God that we were never given permission to engage in. So experience is one aspect of that. And I suspect if we did it here, if I went around the room and asked each of you, tell me a time when God seemed close, even those of you who profess atheism would give me an answer. You'd tell me when my grandchild was born, right? Or when my friend was sick, or my spouse was ill and they got better, or someone I loved passed away and I went to the cemetery. I think the answers would be very different from those kids. I think all of us have these moments when the echo of transcendence enters our lives. And the question of theology is a faithfulness to that experience. That's half of it. The other half are concepts and ideas. And the question is, how do you bridge between the concepts and ideas that the rational mind accepts and the experiences that the heart accepts? Right brain, left brain, heart and head, this kind of thing. And that really is the question of contemporary theology. And what Rabbi Farkas and I were going to tell you tonight is that this is a generational thing. That my generation feels uncomfortable with the religious experiences, and comfortable with the conceptual stuff, but the experiences are a little distant from us. And his generation is much more comfortable with the experiences and finds the conceptual stuff very kind of off-putting. The other piece that I'd like to show tonight before we get into some conversation, and tonight, I promise you, tonight I'm going to let you talk. I know some of you have waited 16 weeks to say something. You had a question for Rabbi Artson, who was our first speaker, and I wouldn't let you ask, and tonight you came to ask. But what's interesting to me is the variety and the diversity of Jewish ideas about God. Again, my Christian friends have very precise dogmas, very precise ideas of who God is, how God works, what God is. And what's really interesting to me is the way that the Jewish tradition has always allowed Jews to use both their experiences and their concepts to create varying ideas about God. So before we get to the conversation, let's take a look at some of them, shall we? And that's on the sheet that I gave you. Everybody got this? And the reason why I think this is interesting and important, to me it is at least, is that if we're going to arrive at a theology for the new century, if we're going to think about what we can believe in God, it's important to know what our ancestors did, because you're going to get a sense of the diversity of opinions, and you're going to set a sense of the repertoire, the lots of different ways. Let's begin together. In the Bible, there is a chapter in which Moses asks the question we asked: who is God? Moses asks this question, which is such an interesting idea, because you think that Moses, of anybody, should know who God is, right? But in the 34th chapter of Exodus, and the reason I gave this to you as well is because it's this week's Torah portion, right? Next week's Torah portion. It's Ki Tisa, after the golden calf story. So you remember the Israelites, Moses goes up to Mount Sinai, he's getting the 10 Commandments, and while he's up there, the Jews build a golden calf. You remember because you were all there building it. I remember you. You were there. You were standing next to me, telling him to get it done quicker and cheaper, right? And Moses comes down, and God punishes the people and says, I'm not going with this people anymore. You take them into Canaan. And Moses says to God, if you abandon us, I'm not going either. We'll die right here. And God says, okay, I changed my mind. And then Moses says, you changed your mind? Who are you? And you have a sense that Moses is asking the same question that we're asking. Who is this God? And the Bible is going to give us a very curious answer. So here's the story. It's in Exodus 34. Moses said to the Lord, see, you said to me, lead this people forward, but you've not made known to me whom you will send with me. Now, if I've truly gained your favor, pray let me know your ways, that I may know you and continue in your favor. I mean, what is he asking God? Who are you? What kind of God are? How can you change your mind? How can you get angry one moment and be forgiving the next moment? Who are you? Moses asked God. And God says, okay, I will do this thing you've asked me, for you've gained my favor. I've singled you out by name. And Moses says, Hareini et kvodecha. It's a very controversial verse in the Bible. Show me your glory. And by glory, the Bible means your essence. Show me your essence. Who are you? And God says, I will make my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim before you the name Lord, and the grace that I grant, and the compassion that I show. But you cannot see my face, for man may not see me and live. What a strange idea. What do you mean you can't see? I won't show you my face because you can't see me and live. But if your God is God, why can't God show you something? Right? And the Lord said, there's a place near me. Station yourself on the rock, and my presence passes by. I will put you in the cleft of the rock and shield you with my hand until I have passed by. And then I'll take away my hand, and you'll see my back, but my face you must not see. So what is God doing? He's playing peekaboo with Moses. You ever do that with a little kid? You take the towel and you go peek, and the kid goes berserk. It's for a 2-year-old, it's a great game. So this crazy idea of God has a face, God has a back, is this literal, is this metaphorical? But you see what the Bible's struggling with. Moses asks the question, who is God? And God says, you won't know. And you can't know my face. Now, one of the interpretations of you can't know my face, but you can only know my back is that you can't know my essence, you can only know the effect I have in the world, which is an interesting way to think about it. And so here's the answer to the story. The Lord came down in a cloud. See, the Bible has no compunctions about saying that, which is kind of odd in itself. Letting me came down in a cloud. What does he need a cloud for? And what did he come down for? Where does he live if he's coming down? Like, was he up and now he's down? Like, and he stood there. God stood there with him there. God stood with Moses there. Where? And proclaimed the name Lord. The Lord passed by before him and proclaimed, Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum V'Chanun, God, compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, abounding kindness, faithfulness, extending kindness to the 1000th generation, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. Yet he does not remit all punishment, but visits iniquity of parents upon children and children's children upon the 3rd and 4th generations. Very interesting. What's going on? I want to suggest to you that you have two ideas of God that are clashing in this text. You have a very ancient pagan idea of God. God as a Superman. A very anthropomorphic, that is human-faced, a very tangible God. This is the God all of us grew up believing in. I think everybody grows up believing in a God who, old man in the sky with a beard. The fellow in the Michelangelo painting. You know who I'm talking about on the ceiling, right? Now, why do we believe in that God? Because all of us have parents. Well, most of us do. And we imagine God as the projection of our parents in the world because we want God to do for us what our parents did for us, which is protect and nurture us when we were small and helpless. And I think that's the beginning of the pagan idea of God, as a God who is powerful and protects and nurtures. And then you have this idea that pushes beyond that, which is an idea of God as greater than just that. And that's what's going on in the text. This is the seam line between two ideas of God, a very primitive, anthropomorphic, simple God as this great guy in the bearded guy in the sky, and a bigger idea of God, which is not anthropomorphic and not bodily. And the Bible's struggling between these two. The Bible's trying to make the case that what God is not important. What's important is how God deals with the world. What's important are the moral qualities of divinity, not the essence of divinity, not the essence of God. Now, the rabbis, when they take this, the rabbis of the Talmud, so we're now going to advance 1,000 years to the rabbis of the Talmud. And the rabbis of the Talmud are going to take the same paradox, but for them, they're going to take it easier. The rabbis are sort of like they've gotten used to living with God already. And they're not as troubled by the mixed signals. It's more easy for them to tell stories about God and let that God be anthropomorphic, that is in a human form, because they're able to say, okay, it's just a metaphor. So you have a couple of ideas of God in the tradition here. Okay, you have the idea that we all say in the Amidah, Mechalkel chayim bechesed, mechayei meitim berachamim rabim, somech noflim verofei cholim, umatir asurim, umekayem emunato lishenei afar. Translation: with kindness, God protects life. Mechalkel chayim bechesed. With caring love, God gives life back to the dead. Mechayei meitim berachamim rabim. God raises the falling, heals the sick, frees the bound, keeps his promises with those who sleep in the dust. Who is like thee among the mighty? Who is like you, King who brings life and death and ultimate freedom? Now here, what you notice is, do we know about what God is? No. What do we know about? What God does. The rabbis they're not going to mess with what God is. They realize they can't answer that question. Moses' question, Hareini kvodecha, show me your essence, they acknowledge, I can't answer that question. But what I'm interested in, really, that's not what I'm really interested in. I want to know how you operate in the world. How do you walk the world? And what do you notice about all of these qualities? Anybody notice anything about these qualities? This isn't really a description of God, is it? What's a description of? Who we should be. This is a description of an ideal human existence. And the idea is that God is the repository, the projection of this ideal human existence. That's what's quite remarkable. That's what's quite remarkable. Now, let's take a look at even a more remarkable set. Look at the next story, right? In Talmud Brachot, they have this remarkable idea that God prays. And listen to the anthropomorphism of this and try to understand what the rabbis are trying to get at. Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Yossi, not Jose, Yossi, okay? How do we know the Holy One, blessed be He, says prayers? Now, what are they talking about? God davens. God gets up in the morning, puts on God's tefillin and a talis, and God davens. How do you know God davens? Because we daven. And if we daven, God davens. Answer to the question, right? Because davening is a full life. And how could you imagine that God would not have a prayer life? So the question is, okay, first of all, how do you know? And they quote a verse, but it's not a very good one. Even then will I bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. It doesn't say their prayer, but my prayer. It's a lousy proof text. What's more important is it's a concept of like prayer is such an important part of their lives. Of course God has it too. It's too good for God not to have it. Right? So now here's the most interesting thing. Rabbi Yehuda Bar Tovi asked the question, what does God pray? My matzlei in Hebrew. What does God pray? What's God pray? If we know what we pray for, right? What do we pray for? Peace, prosperity, strength, wisdom, kindness. What does God pray? So God says the following prayer. May it be my will that my mercy may suppress my anger, and that my mercy may prevail over my other attributes, so that I might deal with my children in the attribute of mercy, and on their behalf stop short of the limit of strict justice. Don't raise your hands, but anyone here ever smack their kid? Or threatened to smack their kid? Or had said something really, really, really threatening to their child? Small, large, adult. And then as soon as you finish, you say to yourself, I shouldn't have done that. I went too far. You ever have that experience? I went too far? And sometimes you're going into a child's room to take care of a discipline problem, and you say this prayer, dear God, give me the strength not to overdo it. It's such a parental prayer, right? Let me deal with my children with love and not with anger. Right? It's a very interesting prayer. It was taught, Rabbi Shmuel ben Elisha once said, I once entered the innermost part of the sanctuary to offer incense. So he was a Kohen. And he went into the Kodesh HaKodeshim. He went into the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. And I saw the Lord of hosts. I saw God seated on a high and exalted throne. Okay, he had a mystical experience. And listen to this. And God said to me, Ishmael, my son, bless me. So who is Rabbi Ishmael? He's the Kohen Gadol. Rabbi Ishmael was the Kohen Gadol. And he goes in on Yom Kippur into the Kodesh HaKodeshim. That's in the Avodah service of the high holidays, which we do around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So I'm not surprised you don't know it, because no one's like awake. And the question is, so when the Kohen Gadol goes into the Kodesh HaKodeshim, what happens there? And the answer is, God said to the Kohen, you're a Kohen, bless me. So listen, this is great. So I replied, may it be thy will that thy mercy may suppress thy anger and thy mercy may prevail over other attributes, so that it may deal with thy children according to the attributes of mercy, and on their behalf stop short of limits of justice. And he nodded to me with his head. So there's two traditions about what this is for, where it comes from. One is, it's the prayer that God makes, and the other, it's the blessing of Rabbi Yishmael for God. Now, what kind of God is this? It's Abba, it's Father. This is Tata. This is a Tatanu, right? This is a fatherly God. And the Bible's not worried about the Talmud's not worried about the anthropomorphism of this. or the corporeality. They're not worried about any of the philosophical problems. The idea that God rules the world as a loving, giving, sweet, caring, gentle Father is important for this community. It's important to them to feel that. That's what they feel. Or to put it the other way around, put it in Rabbi Schulweiss's language, it's in fatherly love that you feel the presence of God. That's where you feel the presence of God. Now, turn the page. Let's skip the next bracha. And we get here. I want to jump now 1,000 more years. We're doing 1,000 years at a clip. So we started with the Bible, and then we get the Talmud. Now we're going to go all the way to Maimonides. Okay, you ready? So here's the Rambam. 12th century, Aristotelian-trained philosopher. And now we're going to get a whole different idea of God. Right? Listen carefully. So Maimonides, what he does in the first half of his book, the Guide for the third of his book, The Guide for the Perplexed, is give us a vocabulary lesson. It's a glossary. And he's interested in looking at the words that might lead us astray when we read the Bible, the words that might confuse us when we read the Bible, right? So the first word in the Bible that's difficult is tselem. God creates man, b'tselem Elokim. God creates man in the image of God. Now, what might you think if you read that literally? I have 2 arms, God has 2 arms. I have 2 legs, God has 2 legs. God may be much bigger than me, but he looks like me. Right? A mini-me. Well, he's maxi-me, actually, right? He's an impatient, middle-aged, middle-class American Jew. Right? So Rambam says as follows. People have thought that the Hebrew language, the word image, denotes the shape and configuration of a thing. Now, right away, that first sentence tips you off. Where is the warm, loving, mythological language of the Talmud? This guy don't like stories. This guy don't like the warm, juicy, gooey Talmudic language. What is he interested in? Hardcore concepts, right? The supposition led them to the doctrine of the corporeality of God. Corporeality means God has a body. On account of its saying, let us make man in our image after our likeness. For they thought that God has man's form, his shape and configuration, right? If man is created in God's image, God must look like man. There you go. Okay? Or a woman, right? Charlize Theron. Scarlett Johansson. God. You ever see her? You'd say, oh my God, right? 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 No, I'm serious. You know, Denzel Washington. You know, my wife once saw Denzel Washington. And she stopped and said, oh my God. I said, Maimonides was wrong, you know, right? The doctrine of the corporeality of God was a necessary conclusion because the Bible says it. The Bible says it. They accordingly believed in it, and deemed that if they abandoned this belief, they'd give the lie to the biblical text. They'd even make the deity to be nothing at all, unless they thought that God was a body with a face and a hand, and like them in shape and configuration. How can the Bible be true if you tell me that all these references to God looking like us are wrong, right? However, God is, in their view, bigger and more resplendent than they themselves, and the manner in which he's composed is not flesh and blood. As far as they saw it, this is as far as you can go in establishing the separateness of God from other things. Now, with respect to that which ought to be said in order to refute the doctrine of the corporeal of God and the establishment of his real unity, which can have no true reality unless one proves his corporeality, you know the demonstration of all this in the treatise. I mean, I'm going to talk to you later, he says, about why God can't have a body. Why can't God have a body? It's simple. If God had a body has limits, boundaries, right? God is infinite. You can't have an infinite God who lives in a body, right? Because then there would be something that's not God, and that's impossible. You see the problem? Okay, we'll get to that later, right? Here is an only indication. The term image is applied to the nature of a thing, not to the shape of it, but to its nature, to the way it is, right? The way a thing is constituted as a substance becoming what it is. It is the true reality of the thing. In man, it is that from which intellect derives. It is on account of this intellectual ability that said of man, in the image of God, he created him. Now, what did we just say? The word image does not mean the way you look. It's the essence of the thing. So the question is, what's the essence of the thing? Now, by the way, this is a long philosophical argument, and if you ever took philosophy 1 in college, and the professor put a chair in front of the classroom, and he said, okay, tell me what makes this a chair. What's the essence of chairness? How much chairness do you need to the... And you spend weeks and weeks and weeks in philosophy school doing this, which is why most people don't go into philosophy, right? Because you do, like, if I'm going to spend my time with chairs, I'll work at IKEA and make some money, right? But it's the essence of a thing. And for Maimonides, what's the essence of a human being? Intellect. Reason is what makes us different than animals. And therefore, when it says, let us create man in our image, what it is that human beings share of God is reason. Intellect. That which is meant by the scriptural dictum, the idea, let us make man in our image, was the specific form, which is the intellectual capability, not the shape and configuration. Now man possesses something in him that is unique, is not found in anything else that exists under heaven, namely intellectual capacity. You are the only creature in the world that can think. Birds fly farther than you fly. Cheetahs run faster than you run. Elephants lift more than you lift. Ants can invade your kitchen without asking permission. You can't do any of that, but there's one thing you can do that they can't do. Think. Thinking, reasoning, is what makes you human. That's what we got from God, says Maimonides. So what is God for Maimonides? A mind thinking. Maimonides' idea of God is fundamentally mind. A mind thinking ideas is what God is. The essence of God is thinking. And every time you and I think, we are channeling God into the world. Now, this idea of God, not as a tatele, not as a father who loves us, and this idea of God as not a presence who is there to lift the fallen and heal the sick, but a mind thinking. It's a very philosophical idea. It's very cold, right? This is not a God who loves you. This is not a God who answers your prayers. This is not a God who's watching out for the Jewish people. What is God doing? Thinking big ideas. Now, you can know that, and you can share those ideas if your mind is trained to do so, right? In reality, human intellect is not like God's intellect, but only the first stirrings. It was because of the divine intellect conjoined with man that it is said that he is in the image of God. So we can join our minds with God's mind. So the philosophical tradition begins with this idea of, I want an idea of God. I don't want a story. Your stories are contradictory. Your stories are full of emotions, and emotions are distracting. I want a clear idea. And the clear idea that Maimonides chooses is the mind that thinks. So for Maimonides, at the core of the universe is a mind thinking ideas, and you and I are the only creature in the world set up to receive those ideas. God is broadcasting ideas, and we can receive them. That's an interesting idea. When you think, that's an interesting idea when you think about that idea, right? And that becomes that's the philosophical tradition. Very different from the gooey, juicy family stories of the Talmud and of the Bible. Now we're going to take one more. Am I confusing you so far? Okay, one more now. Can we have one more? Two more. The mystical tradition. What's a mystic? A mystic is a person who wishes to have, listen to the following words, a personal experience of God. All right, 3 words, personal. The mystic says, well, because all religion is about an experience of God, right? You come to shul, that's what you expect. That's what you pay your money for, right? No, that plus the kiddush. But you come to shul for an experience of God. But the mystic says the normal channels, the normal ways that people experience God, coming to shul, doing mitzvahs, making Shabbos at your table, raising children, giving tzedakah, these are normal ways. I want something better. I want industrial strength. I am going to circumvent, go around the traditional ways of coming close to God. I'm going to find secret back channel passages to an experience of God. Who's going to teach me that? Mystics who have gone before me. There's a long tradition of this. And mystics choose one or two students and whisper in their ears, here's how you do it. Sometimes it's through meditation. Sometimes there's hallucination. So all kinds of ways of doing it. Number one, it's private. It's not collective. It's a personal experience. And it's not through the normal channels. Number two, it's an experience. Don't tell me about God. Don't give me a concept of God. I want to meet God. I want to be, as it were, face to face with God. I want the experience of divinity. I can tell you what it's like to be in the presence of Donald Trump. I can describe to you maybe his background, his policies. I can show you pictures of him. But unless you're standing face to face with the man, you will not know him. You know somebody when you stand face to face with them. And the idea is, this person doesn't want to know about God. Moses says, Hareini kvodecha, show me what you are. And God says, I'll tell you about me. But the mystic says, I don't want to know about you. I want to know you. I want to know you. I want an I-thou relationship with the divine. Right? That's what the mystic wants. So he uses these private back channels to achieve personal experience of God. And then when he's done with that experience, he comes back. He comes back. Now, by the way, there were always mystics who never came back, starting from the early tradition. A person comes back from an ultimate mystical experience and babbles hysterically, and they're called insane, or dies in the middle of the process. So the Jewish community was very worried about people doing this. When I was in college, there were lots of people who thought that they could circumvent the mystical tradition by getting close to God by taking LSD. I don't know how many of you remember those days, but the LSD was a very, very, very powerful drug. And you know, people took LSD. And the interesting thing was I had friends who never came back. I mean, literally took a trip and never came home, which means they went into LSD trips, and when they came back, they were never the same. They were never rational. They could never hold down jobs. It was a very sad thing because it blew people's minds. That was the bad trip. Because the mystical experience did something different, similar, because once you achieve ultimate truth, why do you want to come back to the world for? There's a beautiful Hasidic story about a mystic who spends his whole life seeking that personal experience of God. And on the day that he achieves it, right, his daughter happens to leave the baby in his care, and he's in the baby's sleeping, and he's in the room in a trance. And in the trance, he rises through the seven heavens and achieves what he wants. He's in the throne room of God, and in the trance, he walks into the presence of God, and in the trance, he stands in front of the throne of God and perceives the face of God, just like Moses, and at that moment, the baby starts crying in the other room. And he's torn. Where does he do? And the story is beautiful. The story says, God says, no, choose. Choose. And the mystic says to God, I'm sorry, I got to go. And he goes down into the other room, and he picks up and he comforts the baby. And because it's a Hasidic story, it has to have a sweet ending. So the sweet ending of the story is, in his dreams that night, God comes to him and says, you made the right choice. You made the right choice. I mean, but you see, if you're going to be a mystic, you're leaving the world behind. So the Jewish tradition said the only people who are allowed mystic experiences, you have to be 40 years old, you have to be deeply learned, you have to be married and have a large unpaid mortgage. No, I'm serious. That's what it is. You have to be 40 years old because until you're 40, you know nothing about the world. You're ruled by your passions, not by your mind. You have to be learned because you have to know the dangers of this thing. You have to be married and have a mortgage because you have to have reason to come home at the end of the experience. So here's the mystical tradition. So when the mystic comes back, what does he tell us? What did the mystic learn? And those of you here with Art Green a couple of weeks ago are going to recognize this. So here are two mystics. Moshe Cordovero was one of the mystics of Tzfat. He was a refugee from Spain who came to Tzfat. And Tzfat is a beautiful, beautiful northern town in Israel. And he writes the following: the essence of divinity is found in every single thing. nothing but it exists. Since it causes everything to be, nothing can live by anything else. It enlivens them. Its existence exists in every existent. Now, does that sound obscure enough for you? Mystics tend to write obscure because they don't want ordinary people understanding what they're talking about. They're a lot like rabbis in that, right? They want only people who are really ready to understand it. Do not attribute duality to God. What is duality? God is there, we are here. God is up, we are down. God is other, we are, right? Don't say that, he says. Let God be God. If you suppose that Ein Sof, which is God, emanates until a certain point, and from that point on it is outside of it, you've dualized God. God forbid. Realize rather that Ein Sof, that's God, exists in every existent. Do not say, this is a stone and not God. God forbid. All existence is God. Since God, the stone is a thing pervaded by divinity. Now, a generation or two later, 300 years later actually, you have the Sfat Emet, who's a great Hasidic rabbi, who's going to offer a translation of what the Moshe Cordovero is going to tell us. Listen carefully. He writes this letter. It's a Pesach letter to his kids. His kids live out of town. He lives in Warsaw. His kids lives all over Poland. They're all rabbis, all of his kids, or the wives of rabbis. And he writes them a Pesach letter. And he says to them, I want you to understand Pesach. Most people don't understand how to leap up. The word Pesach literally means to jump. Because we're saying God jumped over the houses of the Israelites. So he said, Pesach is a jumping time. Or leap up. Get the idea? And attach themselves to God. I will reveal to you what I know about it in a forthright manner. Listen carefully. The proclamation of oneness that we declare every day in saying Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, the proclamation of God's oneness that we say every day, needs to be understood as it truly is. The meaning of Adonai is one, Adonai Echad, is not that God is the only God, negating other gods, though this too is true. The meaning is deeper than that. Here's the meaning. There is nothing else but God. This is true even though it seems otherwise. Everything that exists in the world, spiritual and physical, is God himself. Now, that's mysticism. And here's the amazing thing about mysticism. Mysticism, you'll find the same idea in Buddhist mysticism, Christian mysticism, Muslim mysticism, Jewish mysticism. It's clear that it's one of two things, and it's probably both true. One is either it's very true, or two, the structure of the human brain leads everyone to the same conclusion, if you're a structuralist, which is that when the mystic achieves that mystic moment of oneness with God and understanding, experience of God, what he discovers is God is everything. God is all. All is God. Now, if all is God, think about this for just a second. What would that mean? It's called pantheism. What would that mean? I did this exercise with little kids sometimes, and it's a really simple exercise. Stand in front of a mirror, hold out your arms. Touch your head, touch your shoulders, touch your knees, touch your tummy, touch your tush, right? Now, touch your self. Self? What's self? Self is that self-conscious, that sense of me that's in here someplace, right? Now, consider the following proposition. The entire universe is one body, and God is the self of the universe. Which makes us what? Cells in the body of God. You and I, it's not that God's up and we're down. You and I are of God, in God, of God, around. God is all around us. We are part of God. We are the thinking part of God. How's that? Now, just as your body has different organs that do different things, you have lungs that breathe and livers that live and kidneys that kid around, right? God has different parts too. There's planets and galaxies and bugs and platypuses and all the things. And you and I, we are one unique part of God. You could actually say, you want a real idea? You and I are the white corpuscles in God's bloodstream. The white cells in your bloodstream are the ones that destroy infection. That's your job and my job. Now, that's what we are. Therefore, We are all part of the same thing. It's not intuitive that your foot and your finger are part of the same thing. In fact, little kids don't understand this. Little babies, ever see babies in the crib? They don't understand that the foot waving in front of their face is theirs. So you know what they tend to do? They bite it. Drop something on your foot. See how your fingers feel about it. You will discover that you are one. We are all one. We are all, the sense that you are you and I am me and we are self-contained individuals in the world is an illusion. The real truth is that we are part of the oneness. And like cells in a body, if something happens to you, my existence is threatened. How's that? Now, what do you call it when one cell of the body says, to hell with the rest of you, I'm going my own way? Cancer. And cancer can kill you if the cell is allowed to do its own thing. Evil in the world is what cancer is in a body. It's when one of us says, to hell with you, I'm doing it my way. Right? I'm going my own way. I don't need to worry about you. Right? Evil is when one of us forgets that we are connected to each other. We are all part of the one. And we are all responsible for each other's well-being. And that's what he's talking about. That's a mystical idea of God. Very different than the philosophical idea of the mind thinking that we hear. Very different than the juicy, warm family drama of the Talmud. Even very different than Moses' quest to understand who God is. All very different ideas of God, and all authentically Jewish. All right, could we do one more? Are you tired? Tell me if you're tired, because I'll stop. All right? You know me, I can go all night. It's a bad habit, right? Now, here we get contemporary philosophy. Yitz Greenberg, who's been our guest here many times, Orthodox rabbi, dear friend, came here when Rabbi Showeis had his 80th birthday. Some of you were here. And on Rabbi Showeis' 80th birthday, I wanted to give him a present. When a Jew has a major event in his life, what you do is you go get a bigger Jew to give him an award. Right, so they get Elie Wiesel to give you an award, or they get somebody bigger. But who's bigger than Harold Showeis? So I told him, I said, Harold, I want to find a bigger Jew to give you an award, but I can't find one, Like, no one's bigger than you. So here's what I want to do. I want to take the 5 best Jewish teachers in the world, bring them here to celebrate with you. Who are they? And he rattled them off. Yitz Greenberg, David Hartman, right? Harold Kushner, David Ellenson. So they came. It was amazing. They're friends of ours, but they came. So Yitz came and gave a talk. It's the most clear talk he ever gave, right? This is what he writes. This is Yitz's talk on Rabbi Showeis' 80th birthday. How can we talk about God after such an event as the Holocaust? So he's answering the great 20th century question. Listen carefully. My answer is you can't talk about God. You can only recreate the image of God. If you can't recreate the image of God, and you can recreate the image of God like you can recreate yourself, and that is a statement of God's presence. After the Shoah, the Jewish people didn't talk about God. What they did was to recreate the image of God. Now, it's a very interesting strategy. It's very similar to Rabbi Showeis' idea. After the Holocaust, we couldn't speak about God, but we could be godly. So we move the locus of God, the place of God, from God down to us, and we talk about human actions, human behaviors, human responsibility. That becomes the way that you talk about God in the world after a catastrophe like the Shoah. This is the move that you find in Harold Kushner. This is the move that you find in Yitz Greenberg. This is the move that you find in many ways, and even in Abraham Heschel, who's much more of a theist than these guys are, but still talks about human responsibility as the revelation of God's presence in the world. And then Greenberg goes farther and talks about this. He says, the step was for Jewish people to take power. And taking power is our acting godly in the world, because that's what it needs. If you're going to be godly, you need to be able to accomplish something. This is one of the modern responses. So I want to stop here. And what I wanted to show you in 40 minutes was 3,000 years of Jewish God thinking. From the Bible's struggle to move away from the pagan ideas of a physical God who stands in the world, to a moral God who acts in the world with morality, to the rabbinic idea that I'm not interested in God's essence, I'm going to tell all these juicy stories because I don't mean them to be literal, I want you to assimilate the ethics of that God, to a philosophical idea which is purely rational, to a mystical idea which is this sort of encompassing pantheism, and then to the modern idea which in some ways goes back to the biblical move of regaining a sense of responsibility, of human responsibility. And now I would add one more step, having spent the weekend with these young kids. I think the next thing that's coming, and I'm sorry that Rabbi Farkas isn't here to tell me whether I'm wrong or right, the next thing is that I think that young people are going backwards to some of these other older ideas of God because they have a less inhibited, they're not inhibited to talk about experiencing the divine, about knowing the divine, about appropriating the divine, and they're less intimidated by the rationalism that many of us were raised with. And that's where theology is coming. That's where theology is going. So now the question is, so what does it mean to believe in God? And the answer is all of these. All of these. All of these kinds of things. And the question that Yitz Greenberg asked us in the end is, and I think Rabbi Schulweis asked the same question, is where is the locus of the sacred in your life? That is, when you're talking about God, you're talking about that core of value which motivates you most of all. That core, that's that which is most important to you, most motivating to you, most precious to you. That's the place where you start to talk about God.
My question is, I have a very dear friend who's very Bible learned.
Yes.
And she keeps telling me she has a very personal God.
Yes.
And I keep trying to ask her, what does that mean?
That's
and she doesn't answer me.
Great.
Can you?
Personal God means two things. And they're correlated, but they're different things, okay? Number one, when I think of God as a person, okay? I think of God as a he or a she with a personality. When I say the word person, what do I mean, right? When I talk about you as a person or you as a person, I'm talking about something that's different than the chair. The chair doesn't have personhood, nor does it have personality. But a person has personality, which means they have certain qualities that I associate with personhood. A quality of personhood is caring. A quality of personhood is wisdom. A quality of personhood is relationship. A quality of personhood is loving. These are qualities that persons have that things don't have. Okay? So, I could conceive of God in a non-personalist way. I could say God is a force in the universe for good. But a force doesn't have personality. It doesn't have caring. It doesn't have loving. It doesn't have relationship. You see? It's a force. It's an impersonal thing. Personal means it has certain qualities of relationship, and most of all, personal means that it can relate to you. If it's a force, it relates to everybody. But if it's personal, it knows me, right? So for example, right, the couch in my living room will gladly welcome everyone, but my wife won't, okay? The couch is a couch, it's just a thing. But my wife is my wife, and she sees me differently than she sees the mailman. I certainly hope so. Right? Because she's glad to see the mailman, that's what. The difference. But you see, as a person, we have relationships, right? Now, the Jewish tradition maintained from the beginning that God has personhood. You know this because when you open the Bible, you're reading a story about God, and God's a somebody. Not a thing, not a something, a somebody. Now we say, well, not like us, except God is like us. First of all, we use the word he. Not she, he. Right? But already you're talking about God as a person, not it. Right? You say, Baruch atah Adonai. Atah means you. Not Baruch et Adonai, which would be it, you see? So person means I think of God as a somebody, and a somebody can love me. A somebody can care about me. A somebody can love me. Not all humanity, but me. God who cares about me. And that's the other meaning of the word personal. The meaning of the personal means that I have a special relationship with that God. You see? Because I know that God cares about me. You get it? You see? So, the post office doesn't care about me. Let me tell you, this is true. The post office cares about everybody or nobody, right? But my wife cares about me. My mother cared about me, right? My kids care about me, especially when they need money. They care about me, right? It's a personal relationship. It's my God, a God who cares about me. A God who's involved in my life, a God who's prepared to give me wisdom and me strength when I need help. So the two ideas work together. A God who I conceive as a person, and a God who's a person who cares about me as a person. And that's the idea of a personal God. Now, there's an upside and a downside to that idea. The upside is to walk the world knowing, well, remember the old Rocky Marciano movie? There's somebody up there who likes me. Somebody up there watching out for me. Our Father who art in heaven. There's somebody up there watching out for me. And that's a lovely idea. And when I'm in trouble, I can call out to that God. In Yiddish, Tatenu, right? Rabbi Shalom, Master of the world, help me. That's a personal God. That's a beautiful thing to have. There's only one small problem. When something bad happens to me, I say, what the hell? Not just where were you, but you see, it's worse than that. If it's a personal God and something bad happened to me, I must have done something to deserve it. You must be giving this me to teach me something. I deserve it. And sometimes that's very painful, because it's really painful to suffer bad stuff in the world. It's doubly painful for somebody to tell you, and you deserved it. Or God gave it to you. God did that for you, to you. And that's where the personal idea of God comes back to haunt you. That's why Rabbi Schulweis gave up this personal idea of God. Rabbi Schulweis says there's no way to believe in a personal God without thinking that God does bad things to people on purpose and hurts people. And that ends up as leaving people feeling guilty about, I got cancer, it must be my own damn fault. Right? Or my kid has got hurt. It must be I'm being punished. And that rebounds to create a great deal of guilt, a great deal of shame, a great deal of pain, because you double the pain. You have the situation to deal with, and then you have this reality that somehow God thinks I deserve it. And you see how that works? So, go ahead, please. The Shoah, absolutely, because the Shoah is the absolute evil of evils. But I'm telling you, it doesn't even have to be so much the Shoah. Anything bad that happens to you, you have to say, well, this was sent to me by this God. Why would this God do this to me? I must have deserved it. It must be my fault. You see what happens? And that's why you have a big argument in the tradition between people like Rabbi Schulweis, who are giving up the idea of a personal God, and people like your friend who really need to have a personal God. And there's an argument there. And that's how. Does that make some sense? Okay. All right, Vakasha. Welcome back.
Thank you very much. I would really like to understand in the Bible,
yes,
and when you pray, we say
Mechayei HaMeitim.
What does it mean?
What does Mechayei HaMeitim mean?
Because
okay.
I'm waiting for a few of them.
All right. Okay. Mechayei means to bring life, Meitim to the dead. Okay? To bring life to the dead. Traditional Judaism had an idea that death is not final. That there is some way in which we can understand that either that the dead are still alive in some place. We tend to call it in English heaven, which is just sort of a place marker for we don't know what that means and where it is, but we have a faith that somehow they're still alive, or that there will come a point in history when the dead will rise again, when they will live again. We will see each other again. Olam haba, another world. Now, why do we believe in this? There's a simple reason and a complicated reason. The simple reason is there's nothing in the world more frightening than death. It is the simple, most frightening thing that human beings ever have to deal with, the idea that one day we stop existing. It is just the most frightening thing in the world, because the human being, we think of ourselves and we think about our loved ones as being infinitely precious. If they're infinitely precious, how can they die? How can God have put such an infinitely precious thing as a person like this in a container that's so fragile? Rabbi Shalom, you made a mistake. right? Look how fragile the container is. And when the container breaks, the person is extinguished, is gone. We can't believe that something so beautiful, something so good as the person I love is simply gone, extinct, out of the world, extinguished. So we want to believe, we really want to believe that somehow they're still living. Either still living in another realm, or that someday they'll come back to life and we'll get to see them again. Okay? That's the simple reason. Okay? The second, which is a little more complicated reason, has to do with how you look at people altogether. The question is, are we our bodies? Are we our bodies, or is there some part of us which is not the body? Okay? If you say we are our bodies, then you say when a person's body dies, the person's gone, because there's no such thing as that person without the body. If you say, I believe in something else besides the body, call it, English you'd say, selfhood, or soul, neshama, something that is not bodily, but is part of the essence of that person. And that while body dies, that neshama, or that selfhood, or that soul goes on living in some fashion or another. Okay, now, why do people believe in that? Well, I'll give you my own little experiences, 2 quick experiences. Number one, because I've had experiences like I'm sure most of you have had too, of loved ones who have died, and then there are times when I feel in the weirdest way they're still here. My mama still yells at me every morning. Now, the funny thing I will confess to you is Mom's buried at Eden Memorial Park, which is in Granada Hills. That's not an endorsement. That's just a fact, right? I feel nothing when I go there. I go visit Mom all the time because I'm up there all the time. And when I go, I say hi and I leave. I'd have no feeling whatsoever. I don't meet my mother at Eden Memorial Park because my mom would never go to Eden Memorial Park. I meet my mom in the kitchen first thing in the morning, which is where I met her every morning of my life till I moved out of the house and then some. Where she yells at me, which is what she did to me every morning of my life till I moved out of the house and then some. And that's where you meet, so you meet your loved ones, you still have this uncanny sense that they are around. That's one. Two is that when my kids were born, so the beginning of life and the end of life, I remember this bizarre feeling that when my children were born, I looked them in the eye and they looked familiar. Like this kid had a sense of personality from the day he entered the world. He had his mother's nose and my toes, but he had his own personality. There was something there. Now, I can't prove anything. It's complete, utter intuition, speculation, maybe wishful thinking and delusion. I acknowledge that. But because of that, you begin to say, maybe Taka. Maybe Taka, there is a piece of us which is not of the body. And if that were the case, one would imagine that somehow that goes on living in some fashion. And that's where you get this idea of Mechaye Metim. No, it shouldn't bother you personally. Why does it bother you personally?
I don't know. I just don't understand it. Why do we say it so many times?
Because people are terrified of death. And this is a way of saying, some people, if they say it, it makes them feel better. Right. Yes, Stan.
When you got to the 20th century, you didn't include the Jewish thinker Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan.
I didn't include about 1,000 years of thinkers. I tried to do 3,000 years of Jewish history.
When it comes to our view of God in the 20th century,
right.
21st century now, Mordecai Kaplan, I think, is a part of the equation.
Okay, so you
because he didn't even...
Okay, so let me do Mordecai Kaplan in 30 seconds. You ready? No, I can do Mordecai Kaplan in 30 seconds. It's really not hard. Ready? Mordecai Kaplan says, the world of our common everyday experience is the world. Thank you very much. That is the things that you and I experience on an everyday basis, the things we deal with, objects, people, ideas. That's the world. There is nothing more to the world. Now, traditional religion likes to tell us that we have this world, and this world that we live in, the world of our common experience, is nature, and it's run by a set of rules called the laws of nature. And then there's this other realm called supernature, things that are supernatural. They're outside of the laws of nature, and God lives in that realm. So in the realm of nature, everything is born and everything dies. Everything is born, everything dies. But in the realm of the supernatural, you can have things that are eternal, right? In the realm of natural, everything has limits. But in the realm of the supernatural, things can have no limits. Kaplan says, nonsense. Science teaches us one thing. that nature is everywhere, all the time, ubiquitous, uniform. The rules always apply. There is no supernatural. There is no place in the world where the rules of nature don't apply. Okay, hang on. So now the question is, so if all we're left with is this, the world that we live in, the world of common experience, what does the word God mean? Okay? Now the supernaturalist says the word God refers to a somebody, that's the personal God, or a something which is in the realm of the supernatural. And it impedes on our world through miracles. And we can communicate with it through prayer. Right? The naturalist, Mordechai Kaplan, says, no, whatever you mean by God has to be in this world of nature. Now, what in this world of nature applies, can we apply that word God to? And he used a number of different formulations. I'll give you two of them. One of them is the following formulation, which I've used frequently as well. If I ask you the following question, you give charity? And you say, of course I give charity. I say, what charity do you give to? You say, I give to the American Cancer Society. I say, lovely. Why do you give to the American Cancer Society? You say, because dear friends of mine or loved ones have died of cancer or suffered of cancer, and I'd like to see cancer eliminated. I say, do you believe cancer can be eliminated? You say, of course I believe cancer can be eliminated. I say, how do you know? And you say, because look, we've eliminated it here and there. This disease is curable, and this disease is treatable, and people live longer with this disease. And I ask you the following question. What if the universe were so constructed that there is a constant level amount of misery in the universe? In other words, there's so much misery in the universe. And when you cure a disease over here, another one is born over here. You're playing whack-a-mole, right? In other words, you cure cancer, AIDS shows up. You cure AIDS, Ebola shows up. You cure Ebola, the next plague is going to show up. What if the universe were so constructed that there's a constant quantity of misery in the world? Would it make sense to give money to the American Cancer Society? And you say no, because curing cancer is not going to solve anything. There'll be misery someplace else. I'll just keep my money to myself. Let me enjoy my money. I'll go to Starbucks. So why do you give money to Cancer Society? Because you have a belief. You have a belief that the world is fixable. You have a belief that that idea of a constant amount of misery, that's not true. You have a belief that the world is so constructed that it can be fixed. Maybe not perfected, but improved, made more gentle, made less painful, that suffering can be eliminated. That belief that suffering can be eliminated, that the world contains the capacity, and that we have the power to bring relief to pain in the world, and we can make the world more livable, that is not an empirically provable proposition. That's a belief, not a fact. That belief is what we call God. And Kaplan used two different ideas for it. One, he said that there is a sort of trend in the world. He called it a process in the world toward the perfection of the world. The other, he's called it a power for the perfection of the world, and that when you and I do an act of giving charity, like giving money to the Cancer Society, we are not actually doing it, we're channeling that power in the world. That's what he called God. Now you see what he did? He said, what does it mean? God, the God he believes in is not a somebody up there, it's a power in the world that we're all part of. Now it sounds a little bit like Rabbi Schulweis, because Rabbi Schulweis was Rabbi Kaplan's student. Only Rabbi Schulweis was actually a better writer than Rabbi and a better thinker than Rabbi Kaplan, but that's Kaplan's idea. Now here's the problem, Stan. You ready? The problem was, Kaplan's idea makes a lot of sense as long as the world is getting better. And Kaplan was born in 1860-something. No, Kaplan was born in 1885, 1887. And from 1887 until 1939, the world kept getting better. So Kaplan's idea of a power in the world that's improving things made a lot of sense. And then in 1939, the world got a whole lot worse. A whole lot worse. And Kaplan had no answer to that question. If there's a power that makes for salvation, a power that brings the improvement of the world, and it's inevitable, then why is the world, why were we able to turn the world into hell? And that, in many ways, undid Kaplan's idea of God. The Holocaust was something he couldn't account for, because radical evil is really, there's no room in Kaplan's theology for radical evil. Kaplan's theology is fundamentally an optimistic theology. And there was no room for it in Kaplan's theology. So then you have neo-Kaplanian stuff that came out afterwards, but it was never as strong and powerful as it was in the 20s and the 30s when he was talking about this power of salvation. Okay? That was a short answer. No, every theology is still applicable. It just has its advantages and disadvantages. Right. And you can like, I'm not saying you shouldn't like this theology. It has a lot. It has a lot to it that's very lovely. It really does.
From my understanding,
Right.
that the non-divinic God, if you want to call that,
Non-personal God.
There's no divinity if there's no supernatural, but there is God within us. That's the essence
Well,
of creation.
I agree with that.
There was a divine creation.
Right. Well, but you see this understanding. If you look at Yitz Greenberg's ideas, you hear the same basic idea, that you're moving God into the human being and into human responsibility, that's the move that Kaplan, I think, shares with these other guys.
In a sense, that's what Maimonides was saying, too.
It's, in a sense, it is. Yeah. In a sense, Maimonides agrees with him. But in a sense, Maimonides agrees with everybody. You have to read him the right way. Okay, who has the mic? Yes, Douglas.
Before I ask my question, just a comment about what you just said.
Before I say what I want to say, I have a few things I want to say.
In Kaplan's lifetime,
Yeah.
was World War I, where you actually had the application of technology to the use of killing.
Yeah, which
so
was
that you could
yeah.
debunk that getting better through
Right.
that whole time
Except
period.
that World
Because that
War-
was the war to end all wars.
And it was miserable, except the Second World War was worse.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Yeah, go ahead.
So, in 2 months, we're going to celebrate Pesach. The root
God, is it 2 months already? Oh, I got to start
the
cleaning
root
the house.
just start cleaning now. The root experience of the Jewish people.
Go find the back of
And-
the refrigerator.
Your precursors, the rabbis, have decided you got to take humanity out of the story. You read the traditional Haggadah, and
all
all it
about
is
God.
God, God, God.
Right.
And so, what they're, we're celebrating a holiday of God's role in history.
Yes.
Which we've spent almost this entire semester debunking.
Not debunking, that's not the right word. Arguing with. Because our experience, our historical experience, makes it very difficult to believe in that God. Right?
So then why are we doing what we're doing in 2 months?
Okay, well, first of all, because I don't want any chumetz in my house on Pesach. But the real reason, that's a very good question. First of all, the question of what Haggadah you use. And here I think it's interesting that you find different Haggadot rising up in different moments of Jewish history. I gave you all these different ideas of God. Each of these traditions produced its own Haggadah. Now, they use the same core, the same brachot, the same story, the same symbols. But the mystics had a very different idea of Pesach than did the philosophers. And the mystics and philosophers had a very different idea of Pesach than the rabbis did. And the rabbis, I think, had a different idea of Pesach than the Bible does. And we as moderns, what we're waiting for is our own Haggadahs. We're creating our own. And the question is, what Haggadah fits us? Having lived through the age of radical evil, an evil far beyond the imagination of our ancestors, then how does one talk about a God of history? How does one understand a God of history? Now, you can close your eyes to the evil and say, I believe in the God of the Haggadah. Or you can close the Haggadah and say, evil has destroyed it for me. Or you can say, what do I need to believe in this moment of history? What do I need to believe in this moment of history? And I think that's really the right question. So it should impel you to begin to think about what God I want to worship on Pesach. What do I want to celebrate on Pesach? The rabbis, as you said very rightly, wanted to celebrate a God who was the total the redemptive power in the universe. So they took Moshe and all the human redemptive stuff out of out of the Haggadah, made it completely God. Lo ba seraph, lo ba malach. It wasn't an angel, and it wasn't a seraph, and it wasn't a messenger that God sent, but God himself redeemed us from the land of Egypt. And the reason why the rabbi said that, you're going to hate me for this, was because they were living under Roman rule. And they had just lost 2 brutal wars against the Romans. And they believed that the only way they would ever get out of Roman oppression is if God redeemed them. And they didn't want the people rising up against the Romans again. Every time the people rose up against the Romans destroyed more of Israel and more Jews. The rabbis wanted the people to stop revolting against the Romans. So they created a Haggadah that says, exile is the condition you belong in until God decides otherwise. Because they didn't want human political action. In other words, I'm claiming to you that the Haggadah you're using, the Haggadah that your Zaydav was his way through, was just as political as any Haggadah you'll get today. It had a reason for being in its moment. The question is, what Haggadah do we need today? What Haggadah what do we want to say to our children about their responsibility for the world? And I'm going to suggest to you that maybe in Yitz Greenberg's writing, you find, I think, an answer which to me is rather compelling, which is the notion of, now I need you to come back to history. We Jews have made a decision in the 20th century, a very radical decision. We've decided to come back to history again, to take power. We've decided to take responsibility for the conditions of our own existence. If that's the case, then I think we need to tell a different story on Pesach. Now, the rabbis, by the way, just to say that they're not completely out of it, you will find the materials for that story within the rabbinic tradition. You know the story of Nachshon ben Aminadav, right? The Torah is very clear in chapter 15 of Exodus, right? The people of Israel are camped at the Red Sea. Pharaoh's coming down, with his chariots. The people scream to Moses. They get very cynical. They say, not enough graves in Egypt. That's why you brought us out here to die. Moses says, watch the salvation of God. He turns to God and says, what do I do? God says, move forward. Hold your arm over the sea. The sea will split. The people pass through. Pharaoh gets smushed. You all saw the movie. The rabbis read the story differently. In the rabbi's reading of the story, Moses holds his arm over the sea and nothing happens. Nothing. Does it again. Nothing happens. Reads the instructions on the stick. Maybe it's the wrong stick. Maybe it's the wrong hand. Maybe I'm not doing it right. And he doesn't understand why it won't work. According to the rabbis of the Midrash, nobody understood why it didn't work, and they were getting more panicked. Only one guy. His name was Nachshon ben Aminadav. In the Bible, he is only a name in a list of names. In the Talmud, he becomes a huge hero. He sees that God is waiting for a human being to take responsibility for the redemption of the people. So he jumps into the water. And he wades out into the water. And the tradition is his family yells at him and they beg him to come home. And he waves out. And he goes out until the water covers him up and he begins to drown. And when Nachshon was ready to give up his life for his people, that's when the sea split. Now think about that rabbinic story compared to the Bible story. In the Bible story, what do? We stand on the shore and pray. In the rabbinic story, what do? We jump in the water and move. That is a story of human action, of human beings taking responsibility for their own redemption. That's a very different theology. Different idea of God, right? It's in the Talmudic tradition, but it was left out of the Haggadah. I suggest we put it back in the Haggadah. Not only do I suggest you put it back in the Haggadah, when I wrote a Haggadah for this synagogue, I put it back in the Haggadah. What gives you the right to put it back in the Haggadah? I have a name, Rabbi. I'm licensed to put things in Haggadahs. That's why you sent me to seminary. That's why you made me study all that stuff, because I'm licensed to create the theology that my moment of history needs. So are you. So are you. By the way, there's a beautiful gloss on that story. There's 2 glosses. You know what a gloss is? So there's a comment in the margin of a famous Talmud that says, he didn't jump, he slipped. No, but think about that theologically for a moment. The hero is never the guy who's ready to jump in. The hero's the guy who goes, whoops! And that's how you end up as a hero. And then there's even a better one on that one, which says they didn't slip, he was pushed. Which is like, his wife said, go in there, so, which to me is brilliant, But you see, Douglas, what you're asking is a brilliant question. For this moment in history, what Exodus story do we need to tell? And I suggest that having taken, as Yitzhak Greenberg says, having taken power, having returned to history, having regained a sense of divine revelation through human responsibility, it's a different Exodus story we need to tell. Maybe we need to emphasize the plagues a little bit less, because the rabbis take great pride and great joy in detailing all the plagues. Remember that midrash? It says 10 plagues. They said, no, it wasn't 10 plagues, because it said he smashed them with his hand. Hand has 5 fingers. It was 50 plagues. He said, no, he smashed it with, and then it was another one. It says, there's 200 plagues. Then he said, no, it's 250 plagues. I had an Egyptian friend who came to my Seder one year. And he read that and he said, give me a break. I mean, lay off. Enough. But you see what the rabbis were doing. It wasn't the Egyptians they were talking about. It was the Romans. Right? And they were imagining what God would do to the Romans someday. Well, you and I don't need that. Mordechai Kaplan took that out of the Haggadah, by the way. He said, we don't need that. We need to work together with the people of the world. I think we do need it, but not for the same reason, not to kill our enemies. I think it's important to recognize that immoral societal actions bring brutal consequences. And the question is, what are the consequences of collective immorality? That's a better question. So write your own Haggadah. That's what you should do.
Rabbi,
yes,
you ready?
Ronnie. I'm riffing, so you better stop me.
First of all, I want to
now you know why I don't answer questions.
I want to thank you very much for this semester of real study and wisdom. And
by the way, I appreciate that very much. But I just want to recognize that we've had, because we're on tape, we've had some wonderful teachers here, and I hope we're lucky. You have no idea how lucky you are. You have no idea the richness of our Jewish community. And this year, I didn't get people from far away. They're all people who live in the neighborhood. We had Rabbi Artson, who, it's just, one of the great thinkers of the generation. And we had so many wonderful teachers along the way. And Rabbi Farkas had wonderful teachers. And we had Elisa, Thomas Newborn is this female Orthodox rabbi. And we had just wonderful people coming.
And it caused somebody like me really to reflect on
the
question you started us off with, and the wisdom that each of these people and the texts they use just caused me to struggle more with all this and to deal with it.
Good.
And really, with all humility, I'd like to ask you, what is your personal or
time's up.
No, it's very important because you brought so much to us in the way of other thinkers. I'd like to
first of all, all right, so I'll give you two ideas.
If it's fair for you to do that.
You're right. I'll give you 2 ideas. So idea number 1 is I changed my mind a lot. And it depends a lot on my mood. I know that sounds strange, like mood, M-O-O-D. There are moments when I'm very optimistic, and the God that I worship is a God of my optimism, and there's moments that I'm very dejected, and the God I worship is that God too. But basically, I would tell you the following. I had an experience 20 years ago, which some of you know about. I was very sick, and it was the recurrence of my cancer. And the cancer, I had stage 5 metastasized colon cancer, which is fatal in most cases. And we went to see 5 doctors, and one of the doctors literally said to me, is your life insurance paid up? Literally. And I called my life insurance guy just to make sure. And they told me, your chances of living 3 years are really slim. And that's what I went into. And I remember there was a week between the diagnosis and the surgery. And I couldn't, what do you do when you have a week? But, you're going to die. What do you do for the week? And I made a decision, I'm going to do what I do. So I happened to have a teaching thing out of town for a day. So I flew out someplace. And I just needed some time alone. So sitting on an airplane alone, looking out the window, thinking about this stuff, it occurred to me that what had happened to me was I was presented with what I think is the great theological question. And the great theological question goes something like this in my experience. And I said experience is important to your theology. Is the core of reality death, emptiness, darkness, cold lifelessness, and we are just a really happy biochemical accident that happened on this planet and will someday be extinguished forever? Are we the aberration? Is life the aberration? Is life the accident and death is what this universe is about? Or is the core essence of reality life, creation, and we are a channel of that in the universe, and death is the exception? Death is the aberration. You see the question? Like, what is what's the core essence of it all? Is the core essence of it all death and life is an accident? Or is the core essence of it all life and death is the accident? And it seems to me you can't answer that question factually. You can't answer that question factually. That's a question of your orientation to the world. Because if you say that death is the core reality and life is the accident, you're going to live a certain kind of life. But if you say that life is the core and death is the accident, you're going to choose a different kind of life. And I looked out the window of the airplane and said, if I'm given that choice, I'll choose the latter. I'll choose to believe that life and creativity and possibility is the essence of reality, and I have been brought into the world as a channel of that in the world, and as long as I'm able, I will channel that in the world. And that's my purpose in the world. And that's why I'm here in the world. And I can't prove that with any empirical certainty. I can just tell you that facing, rather imminent death, that was the choice that I made, and I've been faithful to that choice ever since. Now, when I want to express that reality, I use a language which is mythical. Mythical language is a way of telling stories as a way of conveying a truth. So the mythical language, I describe God as in personal terms, and I know it's not true. Maybe it's not true. It's not that I can't prove that it's true, but it's a mythical way of describing reality. Right? And the prayers that I use and the texts that I study and the mitzvahs that I do are all mythical ways of expressing that deep commitment that at the core of reality is life. At the core of reality is creativity, is becoming, is being. And that I am a channel of that being in the universe. And that this is a mythical way of expressing all of this. And my people, I have been born into an extraordinary people that has spent the last 3,800 years wrestling with the sense of responsibility that comes if you believe that the core of reality is life. What does it mean to choose life? When Moses says at the end of the Bible, the people come to Moses at the end of the Bible and they ask him the same question. Nu, you're 120 years old, right? What's the bottom line? What's the meaning of it all? And Moses says, I've given you a choice between death and life, good and evil, choose life. I think that's what he's talking about. Choose to see the world in that way. Because if you do, it comes with a profound sense of responsibility to the world. It comes with a profound sense of responsibility to protect life. It comes with a profound sense of responsibility to other human beings, to that which is around, to those around us. And that's the whole tradition of Torah. The whole tradition of Torah is our people's way of expressing what it means to live in the world with a God of life. And it turns out really interestingly that even if we're wrong, we're still right. Because hell, if you're wrong, so what? You'll live a much more loving, creative, giving, generous, caring, compassionate life, and a life with a sense of purpose. And the other side is equally true. I spend a great deal of time dealing with people whose lives are thoroughly screwed up. They somehow come to me for counsel. I don't know why. And I see what happens if you choose the other way. My friend Mark Borowitz, who was here, was our teacher for that night, remember? He'll tell you addiction, the brokenness of the people he deals with, is a product of seeing the world as nothing but death. If you're 22 years old and all you see in the world is death, you're going to take drugs because you want something to remind you that you're alive. And what he tries to do is give them the other choice, give them life at the core of their being, give them a sense of responsibility. Because if you see that if you see that the essence of the world is only darkness, absurdity, and death, you have no sense of responsibility and no sense of purpose and no answer to the question of what am I here to accomplish and why am I here and to what shall I invest my energies. You might as well just go get high. You just go get high. Right? And that's what he spends all of his time teaching these young people. No, you're needed. You're needed. You have purpose. It's the loss of purpose which leaves a hole in the soul, which yields the brokenness of so many young lives. So my people, our people, have decided, let's look at life this way. And let's draw out all the implications of life this way. And that's my theology. That's how I understand this. Right? Now, my teacher, Harold Schulweiss, taught me that, your theology as you state it is not nearly as important as your theology as you live it. That religion is not about whether you believe in God, it's about whether you behave godly. And I think he's absolutely right. Because you can tell me you believe in it, but I'm going to watch your life. I want to know how you live your life. And if you live a life of goodness and a life of compassion and of caring, right? Then you demonstrate that you believe that there's an energy in the world, there's something there, there's life in the world. That's what we're called upon. What makes us Jews, said Abraham Joshua Heschel, is this idea that we are called upon to act in the world. Heschel has this beautiful line: religion begins with the consciousness that something is asked of us. Well, if there's life at the core of reality, then something is asked of every one of us. Protect life. Protect life. That's why it's hard for me to read the news. I don't know about how many of you watch the news at night. I mean, you know what is going on in this world. It's a horror. It's worse than horrible. I mean, and it's hard for me. And I tell you all the time that I try not to get political from the pulpit. But for some reason, here I'm going to condemn both parties. I don't think that they're responding to the world as it is. Either party. There's 24 candidates now, whatever. And I haven't heard one of them say, we should be outraged by what's happening in Syria. Absolutely. 350,000 people have been murdered. In this generation, that's astonishing. And it's going to get worse. It's only worse now. I mean, So but first you get outraged. That's the first thing you do. What do you do about it? I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. But there's a loss of outrage. There's a loss of outrage, right? And I believe that. So I want to hear a little more outrage. I hear a lot of.
People don't get outraged.
So anyway, I don't want to get into that. That's the wrong way to go. But that's the answer to my question. Does that answer the question? No, that's today's answer. Listen, like you, I'm raising kids. I'm working in the world. I'm taking care of people, and I'll change my mind. In an hour. Okay? I want to tell you one more thing is that, the God sent us prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, Ben, and Jerry. Because if there's life at the core of the universe, then ice cream has an important role to play. Ellie, yeah, please. Oh, hang on one second. Let me get her, then I'll get you, I promise. Yes. You know what? I know that. She says there's compassion fatigue. We read the news and we don't know what to do about it, and so we turn away because we feel terrible. Yes and no. Maybe because I'm a clergyman, I'm allowed to be a little unreasonable. Yes and no. I wish that were the case. I believe, how do I say this gently? And for you it's the case because I know your heart. And for you it's the case because I know your heart. And for you it's the case because I know your heart. But when I listen to the cultural conversation, I don't think it's compassion. I think it's obliviousness and selfishness and people more interested in the material acquisitions and comforts of their lives than wanting to know that there's someone else in the world who needs. I hope so. I really do hope so. I hope that you're right and I'm wrong. But that's my problem. I happen to like this Pope, by the way, because I think it's wonderful to have a religious leader who's revered who calls it, who has this sense of outrage. I think the world's needed that for a while. I'd like to hear a rabbi talk that way. I'll put on a white yarmulke and go do it if you like. Right? I'm willing to do it. Yes, please, go ahead.
Rabbi, I have a strong belief in God.
Good.
But the Holocaust has really caused me to question that. And I wondered, it looks like the second paragraph of Rabbi Greenberg's writings here. And I wondered if you've thought there would be value in reviewing that paragraph.
Okay. So the first answer to your statement is, I'm glad you do, because I don't think that any believer in the world can go on believing in the same way after the Holocaust. And I would be worried that anyone does. That kind of evil, so incredibly total and radical, has got to shake anyone's confidence in the world, okay? Greenberg has a beautiful idea here. Greenberg's idea is that he's going to read the Holocaust as a statement from God to us to take responsibility for the conditions of our own existence. Jewishly, that means Zionism and the return to Eretz Yisrael, the return to sovereignty. Universally, that means a sense of universal collective responsibility for our fate, and that's what religion has to deal with today. That's what religion has to deal with today. You can't have a religion which preaches running away from the world, hiding from the world, waiting for God to redeem the world. That's the Nachshon story once again. Waiting on the shore for God to redeem you, Pharaoh's going to take you down. This is what Greenberg is telling us, is that what he reads in the Holocaust is we have to jump in the water, and if we can't believe in God, which it's difficult sometimes, be God. Be that God. Be the God you want to believe in. Be the God you want to believe in. You want a God who redeems? Redeem. You want a God who saves? Save. You want a God who heals? Heal. Rabbi Schulweis used to say something very similar. I once asked Rabbi Schulweis, how do you pray? Because he loved to daven. I mean, he was a mamash davener, For a guy who didn't believe in a personal God, he sure prayed like he did. And he said to me something very interesting. He says, I found a way to pray. I said, really? You found a way to pray? He said, yes, it's very simple. You say a bracha, any bracha, and then add 2 words to the end of the bracha. Through me. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Blessed is God who brings bread from the earth through me. Blessed is God, Rofei Cholim, heals the sick through me. Blessed is God, Oseh Shalom, who makes peace through me. Think about that for a minute. He blesses God. He believes in a God, but he believes in a God who is located not there, but here. The God within, the God that you activate within, that's Schulweis's theology, through me. And he says, that is a prayer I can always say. And that is a prayer I can say with passion because I know how limited I am. And prayer then becomes a very powerful self-critique. It's a criticism of my laziness, of my obliviousness, of my exhaustion. Through me, he says. And that's why he davens. So I think that's one way to answer your question. What's really interesting, and because I know your kids, so it's really interesting is going to be whether your grandchildren have the same problems with God that you do. I'm waiting for grandchildren, so I haven't had the pleasure, but I'm praying for them through me, Right? Dear God, send my grandchildren to day school through me, But yeah, me, right, exactly. You know the joke. You know the joke of he gets married, his daughter gets married, and the wife says, "Go speak to your new son-in-law," and he says, "Let me ask you something. You have a job?" He says, "No, I'm studying Torah. God will provide." He said, "You have a home for my daughter?" He says, "God will provide." He said, "Food on the table?" He says, "God will provide." He says, "You're going to take care of my grandchildren?" He says, "God will provide." So he goes back to his wife and says, "What do you think?" He says, "He thinks I'm God," Yeah. and I'm really interested in whether our children and grandchildren, see, we have this sense of the immediacy of the Holocaust, and we live with survivors, we live with witnesses, we live with people who were there and taught us and told us. I wonder, as it becomes history, whether we change our attitude toward it, whether it stops. I sense this, that as we get farther from it historically and personally, people return to more traditional ideas about God. That's an interesting question. All right, let's do one or two more, and then we're going to go home, because it is Ben and Jerry time.
You talked earlier about concept of God and the experiential component
experience
to it.
of God.
Right.
Right.
When Rabbi Zwieback was here, he brought notes from 1996
Yeah.
in his thesis, and his thoughts from 1996 really were stuck in stone as far as I'm concerned in terms of what his thoughts were today, some 20 years later.
Right.
And so I asked both of you, how did your concept of God change through the years? And you
Yeah.
said it was a little bit more emotional now, if I recall, than it was back years ago.
Right.
I recently talked to Harold Kushner, and obviously the progeria that affected his son Aaron and killed him at age 14.
Yeah.
Your cancer experiences can have a tremendous effect in terms
Absolutely.
of our theology,
Right.
and how we deal with our concept of God. In perhaps more of an emotional one than let's say, a conceptual one or intellectual one, the thinking component that was mentioned here in your text here. So the question I have for you is, you went to Hebrew school, you had a rabbi who never talked about God, you went to a rabbinical school, you went through a transformation, and you're still going through a transformation. What is your relationship with God? It's obviously an active one. And and how do you relate to God on a day-to-day basis? What is your real core concept?
Yeah. I have an idea about what religion is. And I have a concept of religion. Here's my concept of religion. You ever go to the mall looking for something? Sometimes I go to the mall just to take a walk, right? But sometimes I go looking for something. I need something. I need something. I need a shirt, an appliance, a Victoria's Secrets thing. You know, I need something, right? And you go to the mall looking for something, and the thing you look for when you're looking for something at the mall is that display that has a map, right? And you need two things. You need the map, and then on that map, there's a big red spot that says, "You are here." That's religion. Religion is a map of the universe. It is a map of my universe, your universe. It is a map of the world, what I can find in it, what's there in it, what I can expect from it, what's dangerous in it, what's useful in it. It's a map of the universe, and the "you are here" is, and who are you in this universe? How important, significant, powerful, or weak are you in this universe? That's what religion tells us. It tells us what we can expect of life. It tells us what we should strive for in life. What is success? What would it mean to live a successful life? What would it mean to live a successful life? And what does it mean to live a wasted life? And how much control do I have over the conditions of my life? These are the fundamental questions that form the map of my universe. Every one of us has a map of the universe in our head. We carry that with us. We're not conscious of it most of the time, but we have that map. And that's the map that guides us from day to day, from week to week, from year to year. That's the map that guides us, right? And the question is, and then you have these experiences, and that experiences change our map, or they change our place on the map, our sense of the map, right? I spend a lot of time, and you've heard me, some of you were here for lunchtime today, I spend a lot of time talking to kids, especially teenagers, about success. I gave a talk at Milken High School. They invite me every year to talk to the senior class. So I get to talk to the kids, beautiful kids, beautiful kids. And I say to them, I have no doubt that you will be successful. Each and every one of you will be successful. You are bright, you're well educated, you come from fine families, you've had all the advantages of our culture. I have no doubt that you will be successful. I have only one thing that worries me. whether your idea of successful isn't in fact too small. Because what you've been taught to define as success is largely material. Go to college, get good grades, get a good job, make the money you'll need. And I said to them, that's not wrong, that's fine, but that's not success. That's only the first step towards success. Once you've made all that money, then what? What's your purpose in life? What's your dream? What's your aspiration? What's going to give you a sense of a life well lived? And that's a question that you guys, 12th graders, don't get to ask very much because you're too busy taking all your stupid SATs and APs and MCATs and LSATs and all these tests that you have to take in order to get into the world. And so the question is, we've given our children a map of the world that's small and narrow. And you know what happens if they reach the end and they're disappointed? They're disappointed. Yeah, and the question is, why don't we give them a bigger map of the world? And that's my job. The job, I say this at bar mitzvahs all the time. You know, the synagogue is the one place where we're not going to ask you your GPA, or your SAT, or your MCAT, or your LSAT, or your net worth. Because that's not how you measure a human being. At least here it's not. Right? There's 22,000 grave markers at Mount Sinai Memorial Park. Not one of them says A.B. Harvard. Not one. No, I checked. Not one. Not one of them says 4.0 or, you know, died worth $22 million. Not one of them. You know what they say? You know what they say. Beloved mother, caring father, devoted friend, loyal member of the community. They're all about relationships. But we don't teach kids that the quality of your relationships is the measure of your life. We teach kids it's the quality of your wallet. And that's a problem because then they go into the world expecting to be happy, and when they find that they have the money but not the relationships, they come crawling back here. And they say, what happened to me? So the idea of God is part of that map, or it is the map. It's the universe that I live in. And the question is, what are the contours of that universe? What appears on that map? And how is it that over the course of a lifetime of living, of simchas, of great things that happen to you and of tragedies that happen to you, you change the map. You change the map. You change who's on that map. You change what's on that map. You change the size and surface of that map. And you change your sense of where you are in that map. That's what life is about. That's what religion should be about. That's my understanding of it. That's my understanding. What? Well, I just talked about it. I changed maps when I was diagnosed with cancer. It changed my map radically. Because suddenly my map included the possibility that I could die. And at that time I was 43 years old. Okay? 43 years old with 3 small children, and contemplating the idea that I wasn't going to be around to see even one bar mitzvah. That changed my map pretty radically, because then I asked myself, okay, so if you got a little time left, what would you like to do with it? Suddenly my map became a hell of a lot smaller. Okay? So I changed my map. It changed the choices that I made. It came with different choices. It came with many, many different choices. Right? Spending time with Harold Schulweis changed my map, because he expanded my map. He said, you're capable of things you don't know. That's what a great teacher does. A great teacher doubles the size of your map. You're capable of things you didn't know you were capable of. That's what a great teacher does. Great. That's what a Rabbi does for you. See? And so this is, we change our maps all the time. And this is the process of growing up. This is the process of growing theology. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been a pleasure learning with you.